everybody. I'm very happy to introduce our next and last keynote speaker of today. It will be Hannes Gissurarson from Iceland. He is a professor of he's a professor of politics at the University of Iceland. He has written in 2021 the two most recent books are the 24 Conservative Liberal Thinkers Part 1 and Part 2. You can find these books, you can see they're quite big, but worth a read. You can find the books online, you can download them for free as well. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Gissurarson.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to address this very successful meeting of the Austrian Economics Center. I am not an economist, I am a political philosopher, so I don't go as far as one of my intellectual mentors, Ludwig von Mises. A friend of mine, Samuel Husbands, told me that he was Mises's host in his last lecture tour in San Francisco, shortly before actually Mises passed away. And Mises was quite old, and Sam Husbands was taking him and Margit von Mises with him in a car in San Francisco. And then and Mises was dozing off in the back seat, and Margit von Mises was with him. And then they passed Broadway in San Francisco, where there's a lot of striptease bars. And Margit von Mises said, Lou, look, naked ladies. And then Ludwig von Mises woke suddenly up, gave a start, and said, bad for the clothing industry. So he was somebody who was, from the beginning to the end, a true economist. I am not. So I'm actually going to speak about something quite different, which is the political significance of the father of the Austrian school. As was mentioned here, I discussed this in my book, 24 Conservative Liberal Thinkers, the Austrian Tradition. What is interesting is that there are, in my opinion, two major revolutions in economics. One of them made by Adam Smith and the other one made by Karl Menger. I think he's one of the most important economists of all times. And Smith presented us with marvelous insights that one man's gain needn't be another man's loss. And this is something that most people don't understand, even today, that economics is not a zero-sum game or a negative-sum game. It is a positive-sum game where everybody can benefit. And this is by division of labor, by the extent of the market. And the other very deep and profound idea that Smith presented us with was the idea of order without commands, coordination, spontaneous coordination, without anyone ordering us around. Very, very interesting idea, still not understood by all. Menger, however, he began to analyze goods as units, breaking them into units. And that led naturally to the marginal utility revolution. And by marginal utility, Menger could explain value and price, and he could resolve all paradoxes of economics. So it was really a path-breaking exercise. And he also pointed out that even if Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday had been trading to mutual benefit on the island, then that's not how production in a modern society takes place. It takes place over time because you plan for the future, and therefore you introduce uncertainty. And time and ignorance become concepts of ultimate importance in economic life. So this is one of the greatest insights of Austrian economics. But what is interesting is, and I don't think it has been pointed out that much, that once you read Menger's principles, you realize that two of the most popular notions or political ideas of the 19th century were wrong. They were refuted. They were both actually based upon Ricardo's edition or version of Smithian economics. One of them was Ricardo's idea of rent, that land was special because it was in fixed supply, and therefore those who owned the land, they could charge a rent from the land. The demand might expand, but you couldn't produce more land, so there was rent that was being generated. This was a basic idea, and it's based upon Ricardo. The other idea was that labor was special. Ricardo thought that it was labor that created value. Those two ideas, coming from Ricardo, formed the basis of two very popular 19th century political ideas. Marxism and Georgism, as I'm going to argue. But Menger, in the principles, he argues that the traditional distinction between land, labor, and capital is not necessarily relevant, that all goods are breakable into units with marginal utility determining price. So there is nothing special about land or about labor. And the value and price, they are determined by utility for consumers of the last unit, not by cost of production. And this means that Georgism and Marxism are both deprived of their theoretical foundations. It's difficult for us to realize now, although I'm going to argue that it's still relevant, that Georgism at the end of the 19th century was just as popular as Marxism. Indeed, Hayek told me and others that when he was a young man and he was not really a socialist, but he was sympathetic to socialism, and what he found most convincing or plausible was bodenreformers, the land rent people. Very interesting. So Georgism was even more popular, and here you can see Henry George, than Marxism. Henry George said that land was given to us, that it was a gift of God or nature, and it was not produced in the sweat of our brows. So landowners were exploiting other people by charging land rent. And there should be a land tax expropriating the land rent, and that would be able to replace all other taxes. And many thinkers in the 19th century, including Proudhon, the young Herbert Spencer, and even John Stuart Mill, they were sympathetic to this idea. But we have since discovered that it is almost impossible to distinguish between the contribution of nature and the contribution of man or the owner. And it was an error that land rent would really be crucial, what really it doesn't really mean so much in the whole totality of production. But nevertheless, Georgism had some moral appeal, and I believe it is because if we see somebody that earns money from buying land at one price and selling it 2 years later at another price, then we feel that he hasn't really contributed anything. But this is totally wrong, because speculation on the market is actually creating value by transferring capital from a less profitable and productive use to a more profitable and productive use. But the old idea, stemming from the face-to-face society, the agricultural society, the small community in which we all were born in the old days, and which has been the source of our traditional values, says, you know, you only should get what you've earned, what you've created with your hands, what you have made in the sweat of your brow. So this is one of the atavistic ideas that support socialism. And I cannot really go into it much, but I just wanted you to underline that Georgism is still alive in some places. For example, in Iceland, we have developed a very profitable and sustainable system in the fisheries with so-called individual transferable quotas. And this has meant that the owners of fishing firms, they have earned a lot of profit by virtue of being the holders of these quotas. And then there are people in Iceland that want to expropriate the profit from it. This is Georgism. This is just Georgism disguised in modern clothing. I will not go here into the debate about this in Iceland. If you would, I've written 2 books which are both available in English on the problem, so you can find them out. But I'm just mentioning this here to show you that Georgism is still alive in the Icelandic fisheries, at least. Then another thing which has not really been noticed very much is that John Rawls' theory of justice is really Georgism in persons. Here is John Rawls, who used to be the greatest icon of left-wing thought. I think Thomas Piketty has now replaced him, and the very interesting contrast between John Rawls and Thomas Piketty is that John Rawls was worried about the poor. Piketty is only worried about the rich. John Rawls wanted to lift up the poor. Thomas Piketty wants to put down the rich. Quite a difference. I have some sympathy with the Rawlsian enterprise. I think there is an interesting question whether the society is just, which maximizes the conditions of the worst off. Okay, it's quite debatable. But I'm not going to discuss that now here. I'm only going to point out that Rawls, he argues that nature distributes talents randomly, so that individuals do not deserve the extra income from their talents. And this is actually Georgism, but in a different version. It is that you haven't earned what you inherit of talents and abilities. And therefore, you have no claim on the extra income which you inherit by the use of your talents. Just the same conceptual apparatus as Henry George had about land. Instead, it is just individual talent and abilities that are in question. But I think this is erroneous, that Rawls is wrong, that the right kind of distribution is a distribution where marginal utilities in the Mengerian sense are involved. This is income distribution by choice, and Robert Nozick, he tells a famous story about Wilt Chamberlain, and I will just tell this here in 1 minute in a different way. Let us say that Milton Friedman comes to Iceland, and then he holds lectures, and he sells admission to the lectures. And each one has to pay $100 for the entrance. And this means, because people flock to his lectures, that he will go from Iceland with, let us say, $100,000 in his pocket. And the people who bought themselves into the lectures will each of them be poorer by $100. But what is wrong with this? Nothing. This was distribution by choice. You know, you are chosen. You have provided the service that people are perfectly willing to purchase. And this is the basis of the Wilt Chamberlain example in Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, and I was just using here the example of Milton Friedman. Then we have a Mengerian and Hayekian point about it, in addition to the one about choice, and in fact closely related to choice. It is that our income, if it is freely generated by choice in the market, where goods and services are broken into units, and then the units are traded, and the marginal utility decides the price of the last unit, then this is information about the worth of our abilities to other people, and a signal to us how we can best develop our talents and abilities to be of benefit to other people. So there's a lot of information which is contained in distribution by choice, as Menger would have recognized. And if we begin to redistribute, if we begin to transfer income from those who have got it by choice and get it to somebody else, then we are contaminating this information. We are more or less confusing the signals, the road signals. If we want to go from from Vienna to Berlin, we suddenly put on a road signal, no, don't go to Berlin, go to Warsaw. It's a confusion, it's contamination of information. Because if you do not price labor according to its marginal utility, then you are foregoing this information which is contained in the prices in the labor market. This is Georgism. And as I argue, Rawls' theory of justice is just Georgism in persons. But then I would like to turn to Karl Marx. And it's very interesting how Marx became a communist. He became a communist in 1842, when he was the editor of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. And he saw that the owners of forests in Rhineland, they started to prohibit poor people from collecting dead wood. And he said, why should you do that? Aren't the owners of the forests the real thieves? Because the people have been collecting dead wood for centuries and so on. So he became a communist because he thought that the owners of forests shouldn't be able to collect any charges or prices from the poor in the forests. And this is a bit of a Georgian or Georgist consideration. Marx was a disciple of Ricardo, and Paul Samuelson actually in his textbook says that in economic history or the history of economics, Marx should be regarded as a minor disciple of Ricardo. Maybe a little bit dismissive to say so. I think it was an interesting, powerful thinker, but he believed in a cost of production theory. So that wages were the cost of production, that is to say, the cost for workers of staying alive and reproducing. And then he developed his theory of exploitation as a logical consequence of this conceptual framework. Capitalists use their bargaining power to impose longer hours on people to create surplus value. But Menger actually didn't mention Marx, but he mentioned Ricardo. Menger pointed out that goods, including labor, are valued according to their marginal utility. And that's basically what determines value everywhere. The reason why we like old wine rather than new wine, and we like new bread rather than old bread, is that we just find them better. Our subjective value determines this. But today we have Marxism that dares not speak its name. We have, even if Marxism has been refuted intellectually and socialism has failed everywhere, we have Marxism in disguise. One of them is radical feminism, where the bourgeoisie is replaced by patriarchy, and it totally ignores marginal utility, Menger's marginal utility. Because if it was actually true that there was a patriarchy which suppressed women and paid women less than they are worth on the market, then there would be an enormous profit opportunity to establish companies that would use the talents of those people and pay them the right price. Why are those companies not existing if the radical feminists are right? It's if you just invoke Menger, then you see why they are wrong. Then eco-fundamentalists, they substitute exploitation of labor with the exploitation of nature. We are in some ways raping Gaia, the mysterious nature. Capitalism is. And if you have read Menger's principles, then you realize that if all resources are correctly priced, then there wouldn't be any exploitation or overutilization of natural resources. And the way to do so is to construct units that are tradable. And let me just give you one example. Why is it that the sheep in Iceland are not in any danger of extinction, whereas the elephants in Africa are in danger of extinction? It is because the sheep in Iceland are owned. There are property rights to them, whereas the elephants in Africa do not have any property rights. So what is the solution? It is to define property rights to the elephants and to the rhinos and to other parts of nature which are now being overexploited so that they will be priced correctly at the margin. And if it is not possible, then it is something wrong, I think, with the whole argument, if you cannot do so. So private property is still something that is crucial. And in both these cases, in the case of the radical feminism and in the case of eco-fundamentalism, the exploitation or possible exploitation of women, it took place in the past, obviously, and in the overutilization of nature, what we have to do is to remove barriers to trade everywhere. Then finally, I come to Menger's positive contribution. Because my argument was that if you read the principles carefully, then you see that they are a refutation both of Georgism and Marxism. But he also had a positive contribution. And it is an analysis of the institutions that are the unintended consequences of human action. That is to say, what Hayek called spontaneous orders. And the two examples that Menger gave were money and language. And this is a fascinating research program. And on this, we can base a whole theory of the extended order, like Hayek does, civil association, like Oakeshott does, or the open society, like Popper does. And therefore, I believe that Menger belongs to what I try to identify and argue for as the conservative liberal tradition. But perhaps I should finally just make one observation. In September 1979, Hayek was in London. And Mrs. Thatcher, who had become Prime Minister in May 1979, she heard about this. So she decided to invite Hayek to lunch at 10 Downing Street. And she greeted him at the door, and she said to him, "Professor Hayek, I know precisely what you're going to say. You are going to say that I haven't done enough. And you're absolutely right." And Hayek told me that she totally disarmed him there. But let us follow the instructions of Mrs. Thatcher. We have not done enough. We have to continue. This has been a successful conference, but there is a lot of work to do, and we have not done enough.
But you can find the people with the microphone on both sides. But before we start, I would like to ask Professor Gissurarson, because you attacked a lot on the you attacked the Georgian land tax, let's say. What would and we know that neither Menger nor Hayek nor Mises were anarchists. So how do they? What tax is better, let's say, from a moral point instead of the Georgian, let's say, land tax?
Well, I can tell you what really, if I were a hardcore musician and I was waking up from a doze in the taxi and I was responding to the question, then it would probably be an equal contribution, a community charge, an equal contribution of everybody to the production of public goods. That would really be the only just tax. But I don't think that would be politically possible, so I think that a flat income tax is something that ought to be done, and that's actually what we did in Iceland. We had a comprehensive liberalization program there from 1991 to 2004, and we managed to lower the tax and make it into a flat tax over, of course, a tax-free minimum account.
I see a gentleman in the back with the first question.
I'm just wondering, you speak about these eco-fundamentalists, but they are defending resources which somehow common resources which somehow belongs to all of us. So in some sense we can interpret it as they are protecting their property against quick exploitation. So shouldn't liberals and libertarians support this movement as they are protecting their property rights?
I think actually that there has been a fundamental misconception about eco-fundamentalism because people think that this is a controversy between nature and man. But it is actually a controversy or a conflict between two groups of men that want to utilize resources in different ways. And let me give you an example from my own country, Iceland. We do whaling. And the American environmentalists, they want to prohibit us from doing whaling and do all kinds of sanctions and so on us. Now, is this really a controversy or conflict between whale and man? No, it is a controversy between two groups that want to utilize the whale stock in different ways. Those who want to let it be roaming around in the sea so that they can retreat to the Caribbean in the wintertime as they do, the whales, or those of us who want to harvest the whales. You know, those are two groups that have two different concepts about it, but that is not the whole story. There is also another thing about it. It is that the whales, they have to feed in the Icelandic grounds. And the whales, they consume 6 million tons, according to marine biologists, of the krill and the small fishes and seafood. And we actually in Iceland, we harvest in our waters about 1 million tons of fish. So what the environmentalists, the rich people who pay to the Sierra Club, are trying to do is to let us feed their pets. You know, it is like if you would have a farmer that would drive his cows to the fields of another farmer and feed on them, but prohibit this other farmer from slaughtering the cows and using the hide and selling the meat. So I think that there is a great misunderstanding around about eco-fundamentalism.
Now we have in the front.
Thank you, Professor, very much. I was thinking of a few questions. I would like to start with the following. I suppose you would agree with me that probably the European Union currently has, you know, departed a little bit from its conservative liberal roots. If you agree with that statement, what do you think would be the reforms needed in order to go back to the origins of the European Union that in many ways were very liberal, very conservative, and very good as I see it? Thank you.
This is such a large question that I would need a whole lecture to answer it, but I'll just give you the short version, and it is this. There was actually an attempt or an experiment similar to the European Union in the Danubian monarchy, in the Habsburg monarchy, and it had its good sides, and then we should learn some lessons from it. The good thing about the Habsburg monarchy was that it was a common currency area and it was a free trade area. And this is what the European Union should be. But the problem was that there were all kinds of units, political units, and communities that didn't have self-government. And therefore, there was great discontent. They didn't feel at home. They didn't identify with the state. And the right thing would have been to do the same as Switzerland did in the mid-19th century, which was to decentralize, to allow everybody who wanted to be in a political community to do so, and have as many cantons and have as many exit options as possible, because then the problem doesn't arise whether one group is oppressing another group or forcing their preferences on other people. This is what my friends in South Africa suggested. When I was in South Africa, a fascinating country, in 1987, I became a little bit acquainted with their problems, and two friends of mine there, Leon Löw and Francis Kendall, they wrote a book called South Africa, The Solution, where they said, we know that apartheid has to end. It is unjust. What we have to do is two things. We should privatize all public properties and use the proceeds to compensate the oppressed. And then we should divide South Africa up into many cantons. Some cantons will be dominated by the blacks, some will be dominated by the Indians, some will be dominated by the coloreds, and some will be dominated by the whites. And if you feel ill at ease in one of these communities, you don't feel at home there, then you just move to another canton. And this is precisely how I see Europe. I see Europe not as a closed state, but as an open market with self-chosen, spontaneous, decentralized communities that may be evolving, and it's an open question how they evolve. And there was a French philosopher of the 19th century who said about the nation, what is a nation? It's a daily plebiscite or a daily referendum on where you do belong. So it is a question that the liberal would leave open. Which is your political community? The liberal would only believe in three principles. That's at least the argument in my book. And these three principles are private property, free trade, and limited government.
Before we go with the question from the audience, I would like to ask you about property rights. I think that everybody here will agree. I think that a lot of people on the left and the right will agree on the importance of property rights. You've mentioned the Icelandic sheep and the elephants in Africa. So we all know the importance of property rights. The West and America, for example, bring freedom to the world all the time. But why don't we bring the let's say property rights in Africa for so long?
I think actually we have seen a miracle with a free market in the last 20 or 30 years. We were discussing this, what would Mises and, I don't want to be ruled from the graves, not at all. And Hayek and Mises were wonderful people, and, we have to move on. However, I think it is very important to ask ourselves, wouldn't they be happy about seeing what has been taking place in the world with the extension of economic freedom according to the index of economic freedom, even if we have now suffered a temporary setback? Socialism has totally failed. And Austrian economics, some people think that Austrian economics is something irrelevant. Not at all. It was a great success of Austrian economics, what happened in Italy, Germany, and Austria after the Second World War, when Luigi Einaudi in Italy, Reinhard Kamitz in Austria, and Ludwig Erhard in Germany, they all reconstructed the societies on liberal principles, and there were economic miracles there. And then we had the Central and Eastern Europe, with Václav Klaus and Mart Laar and Leszek Balcerowicz, they're making a miracle. And our guest of honor here is a good example of what can be accomplished. So I believe that Austrian economics is still very politically significant, and I am optimistic about this. I don't think we are losing. We may have to go one step back in order to go 2 steps forward.
In the middle, there is a gentleman.
Thank you. Since you talk about Europe after World War II, and you think about Austria and Germany you were talking about, part of that was kind of what they called a soziale Marktwirtschaft, where there were certain basic things, like, for example, in Austria, you've got this thing called the Sozialpartnerschaft, Everybody in Austria signs collective contracts, so certain minimum things like social insurance, vacations, things like that are sort of regulated. And because the companies don't have to compete against other companies that are under different circumstances, it does lead to a sort of raising or ensuring of a large middle class. Now, do you see that kind of interventionism as threatening the free market in the way that you're thinking?
It is a very interesting question. Ludwig Erhard said to Hayek, and Hayek told me, and of course many other people, that the reason he used the words soziale Marktwirtschaft was simply to emphasize that Marktwirtschaft was in its nature, the market order was in its nature social. Because, you know, competition is cooperation. Competition is that you and I, we trade to the mutual benefit of us, so there is no problem with it. However, there is perhaps a difference between the 24 authors that I write about in my book, the conservative liberal authors, and perhaps some American libertarians. And, you know, I like them, I have sympathy with them, I think they are very fresh and radical, and it's good to have the challenge from them. But they seem occasionally to hate the state on principle. They are hostile to the state. Conservative liberals, they want to limit the state, but the state has to be strong where it has to be strong. It has to provide law and order. And the special circumstance in Germany after the war, and actually from the late 19th century, the Bismarckian Germany, was that there was so much monopoly capitalism in Germany. And this is what Walter Eucken and Wilhelm Röpke and the other liberal economists, they saw. So for them, monopoly was something that the state had actively to campaign against. But I believe that that proposition of theirs, or their proposal, or their project, was more a product of the special German circumstances than an integral part of the conservative liberal project, because mostly competition will solve these problems, and that's what we have actually seen. The innovations in technology and globalization have increased competition and not monopoly.
With this, I would like to thank Professor Gissurarson and this conference. I would like to invite Barbara and Federico for the closing remarks. Thank you, Professor.